magic medicine it shall be. George sat himself down at the table in the kitchen. He was shaking a little. Oh, how he hated Grandma. He really hated that horrid old witchy woman. And all of a sudden, he had a tremendous urge to do something about her. Something whopping. Something absolutely terrific. A real shocker. A sort of explosion. I'm not going to be frightened by her, he said softly to himself. But he was frightened, and that's why he wanted suddenly to explode her away. Well, not quite away, but he did want to shake the old woman up a bit. Very well then, what should it be, this whopping, terrific, exploding shocker for Grandma? As George sat there, pondering this interesting problem, his eye fell upon the bottle of Grandma's brown medicine standing on the sideboard. Rotten stuff it seemed to be, and it didn't do her the slightest bit of good. She was always just as horrid after she'd had it as she'd seen before. So, thought George suddenly, I shall make her a new medicine, one that is so strong and so fierce and so fantastic it will either cure her completely or blow off the top of her head. Here we go then, cried George, jumping up from the table. A magic medicine it shall be. A red glow burst suddenly across the enchanted sky. Above them, as an edge of dazzling sun, appeared over the sill of the nearest window. The light hit both of their faces at the same time, so Voldemort's was suddenly a flaming blur. Harry heard the high voice shriek as he too yelled his best hope to the heavens, pointing Draco's wand. Avada Kedavra! Expelliarmus! The bang was a cannon blast, and the golden flames that erupted between them at the dead centre of the circle they had been treading marked the point where the spells collided. Harry saw Voldemort's green jet meet his own spell, saw the Elder Wand fly high back against the sunrise, spinning across the enchanted ceiling like the head of Nagini. Spinning through the air towards the Master it would not kill, who had come to take full possession of it at last. And Harry, with the unerring skill of a seeker, caught the wand in his free hand as Voldemort fell backwards, arms splayed, the slit pupils of the scarlet eyes rolling upward. Tom Riddle hit the floor with a mundane finality, his body female, feeble and shrunken, the right hand empty, the snake-like face vacant and unknowing. Voldemort was dead, killed by his own rebounding curse, and Harry stood with the two wands in his hands, staring down at his enemy's shell.
Fern loved Wilbur more than anything. She loved to stroke him, to feed him, to put him to bed. Every morning, as soon as she got up, she warmed his milk, carried his bib on, and held the bottle for him. Every afternoon, when the school bus stopped in front of her house, she jumped out and ran to the kitchen to fix another bottle for him. She fed him again at supper time, and again just before going to bed. Mrs. Arable gave him a feeding around noontime each day when Fern was away in school. Wilbur loved his milk, and he was never happier than when Fern was warming up a bottle for him. He would stand and gaze up at her with adoring eyes. For the first few days of his life, Wilbur was allowed to live in a box near the stove in the kitchen. Then, when Mrs. Arable complained, he was moved to a bigger box in the woodshed. At 2 weeks of age, he moved outdoors. It was apple blossom time, and the days were getting warmer. Mr. Arable fixed a small yard especially for Wilbur under an apple tree, and gave him a large wooden box full of straw with a doorway cut in it, so he could walk in and out as he pleased. "Won't he be cold at night?" asked Fern. "No," So to father, you watch and see what he does.
The wolf pulled the bobbin and the door opened, and then he immediately fell upon the good woman and ate her up in a moment, for it had been more than 3 days since he had eaten. He then shut the door and got into the grandmother's bed, expecting Little Red Riding Hood, who came some time afterwards and knocked at the door. Tap, tap. Who's there? Little Red Riding Hood, hearing the big voice of the wolf, was at first afraid, but, believing her grandmother had a cold and was hoarse, answered, "It is your grandchild, Little Red Riding Hood, who has brought you a cake and a little pot of butter mother sends you." The wolf cried out to her, softening his voice as much as he could, "Pull the bobbin and the latch will go up." The Little Red Riding Hood pulled the bobbin and the door opened. The wolf, seeing her come in, said to her, hiding himself under the bedclothes, "Put the cake and the little pot of butter upon the stool, and come get into bed with me." Little Red Riding Hood took off her clothes and got into bed. She was greatly amazed to see how her grandmother looked in her night clothes, and said to her, "Grandmother, what big arms you have! All the better to hug you with, my dear." "Grandmother, what big legs you have! All the better to run with, my child." "Grandmother, what big ears you have! All the better to hear with, my child." "Grandmother, what big eyes you have! All the better to see with, my child." "Grandmother, what big teeth you have got! All the better to eat you up with." And saying these words, this wicked wolf fell upon Little Red Riding Hood and ate her all up.
On Monday he ate through one apple, but he was still hungry. On Tuesday he ate through 2 pears, but he was still hungry. On Wednesday he ate through 3 plums, but he was still hungry. On Thursday he ate through 4 strawberries, but he was still hungry. On Friday he ate through 5 oranges, but he was still hungry. On Saturday he ate through 1 piece of chocolate cake, 1 ice cream cone, 1 pickle, 1 slice of Swiss cheese, 1 slice of salami, 1 lollipop, 1 piece of cherry pie, 1 sausage, 1 cupcake, and 1 slice of watermelon. That night he had a stomach ache. The very hungry caterpillar then ate through 1 green leaf. He started to feel better. Now the caterpillar was no longer small. He was a big, fat caterpillar, little big. He built a small house called a cocoon around himself. He stayed outside for more than 2 weeks, then he nibbled a small hole in the cocoon, pushed his way out, and a beautiful butterfly.
Only once a year, on his birthday, did Charlie Bucket ever get to taste a bit of chocolate. The whole family saved up their money for that special occasion. And when the great day arrived, Charlie was always presented with 1 small chocolate bar, all to eat by himself. And each time he received it, on those marvellous birthday mornings, he would place it carefully in a small wooden box that he owned, and treasure it as though it were a bar of solid gold. And for the next few days he would allow himself only to look at it, but never to touch it. Then, at last, when he could stand it no longer, he would peel back a tiny bit of the paper wrapping at one corner to expose a tiny bit of chocolate. And then he would take a tiny nibble, just enough to allow the lovely sweet taste to spread out all slowly over his tongue. The next day, he would take another tiny nibble, and so on, and so on. And in this way, Charlie would make his 6-penny bar of birthday chocolate last him for more than a month.
Alice was beginning to get very tired of sitting by her sister on the bank and having nothing to do. Once or twice she had peeked into the book her sister was reading, but it had no pictures or conversations in it. And what is the use of a book for Alice without pictures or conversations? So she was considering in her own mind as well as she could, for the hot day made her feel so very sleepy and stupid, whether the pleasure of making a daisy chain would be worth the trouble of getting up and picking the daisies. When suddenly a white rabbit with pink eyes ran close by. There was nothing so remarkable in that, nor did Alice think it was so very much out of the way to hear the rabbit say to herself, "Oh dear, I shall be late." When she thought it was over, afterwards occurred to her that she ought to have wondered at this. But all the time it seemed quite natural. But when the rabbit actually took a watch out of its waistcoat pocket and looked at it and then hurried on, Alice startled to her feet, for it flashed across her mind that she had never seen a rabbit with either a waistcoat pocket or a watch to take out of it. And burning with curiosity, she ran across the field after it, and it was just in time to see it pop down a large hole under the hedge. In another moment, down went Alice after it, never once considering how in the world she was going to get out again.
Very slowly the young lady on the platform raised her hands to her face. I saw her gloved fingers unhooking something behind her ears, and then she caught hold of her cheeks and lifted her face clean away. The whole of that pretty face came away in her hands. It was a mask. As she took off the mask, she turned sideways and placed it carefully upon a small table, and when she turned around again and faced us, I very nearly screamed out loud. That face of hers was the most frightful and frightening thing I've ever seen. Just looking at it gave me the shakes all over. I was so crumpled and wizened, so shrunken and shriveled, it looked as though it had been pickled in vinegar. It was a fearsome and ghastly sight. There was something terribly wrong with it, something foul and putrid and decayed. It seemed quite literally to be rotting away at the edges, and in the middle of the face, around the mouth and cheeks, I could see the skin all cankered and worm-eaten, as though maggots were working away in there. There are times when something is so frightful you become mesmerised by it and can't look away. I was like that now. I was transfixed. I was numbed. I was magnetised by the sheer horror of this woman's features. But there was more to it than that. There was a look of serpents in those eyes of hers as they flashed around the audience. I knew immediately, of course, that this was none other than the Grand High Witch herself. I knew also why she had worn a mask. She could never have moved around in public, let alone book in a hotel with her real face. Everyone who saw her would have run away screaming.
If
you live to be 100, I want to live to be 100 minus 1 day, so I never have to live without you. Piglet sailed up to Pooh from behind. Pooh, he whispered. Yes, Piglet. Nothing, said Piglet, taking Pooh's hand. I just wanted to be sure of you. We'll be friends forever, won't we, Pooh? Asked Piglet. Even longer, Pooh answered. If ever there is tomorrow when we are not together, there is something you must always remember. You are braver than you believe, stronger than you seem, and smarter than you think. But the most important thing is, even if we're apart, I'll always be with you.
Lucy felt a little frightened, but she felt very inquisitive and excited as well. She looked back over her shoulder, and there, between the dark tree trunks, she could still see the open doorway of the wardrobe and even catch a glimpse of the empty room from which she had just set out. She had, of course, left the door open, for she knew that it is a very silly thing to shut oneself into a wardrobe. It seemed to be still daylight there. I can always get back if anything goes wrong, thought Lucy. She began to walk forward, crunch, crunch, over the snow and through the wood towards the other light. In about 10 minutes she reached it and found it was a lamppost. As she stood looking at it, wondering why there was a lamppost in the middle of a wood, and wondering what to do next, she heard a pitter-patter of feet coming towards her, and soon after that a very strange person stepped out from among the trees into the light of the lamppost. He was only a little taller than Lucy herself, and he carried over his head an umbrella, white with snow. From the waist upwards he was like a man, but his legs were shaped like a goat's. The hair on them was glossy black, and instead of feet he had goat's hoofs. He also had a tail, but Lucy didn't notice this at first because it was neatly caught up over the arm that held the umbrella so as to keep it from trailing in the snow. He had a red woolen muffler round his neck, and his skin was rather reddish too. He had a strange but pleasant little face, with a short pointed beard and curly hair, and out of the hair there stuck 2 horns, one on each side of his forehead. One of his hands, as I have said, held the umbrella. In the other arm he carried several brown paper parcels. What with the parcels and the snow, it looked just as he had been doing his Christmas shopping. He was a fawn, and when he saw Lucy, he gave a start of surprise that he dropped all his parcels.
Who are you? Hey, who are you? Hey, who are you? There. Hey, 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 yeah, yeah. Who are ya? Who are ya? Who are ya? Who's that behind the mask? Who are ya? Who are ya? Who are ya? Who's that behind the mask? Looking at me in the mirror, that's a kind of new face that I see. Even if I get closer, I'm not looking anything quite like me. I used to be somebody, now I be a little different. If I played the game, sound the same, change my name, bring out my